public stimulus.
On one way, it's absolutely fundamental, our action inside our countries, to make our governments, our societies, and our economies comply with the climate issue. On the other hand, it is necessary to act on the multilateral level. We know that the UN process is flawed. When I go there, and I've been in Bali, I've been in Montreal, I've been in Copenhagen, and what I see is this spirit of negotiation that's very much alike if it were a commercial round. If we were at the GATT, the Uruguay round of the OMC. There's no sense of urgency. All the delegations are there into trying to negotiate small little advantages for their own countries. And what we see is very frustrating, especially since Copenhagen, where there were big expectations and an enormous frustration. I just came from Beijing. I was as a parliamentary observer at the BASIC meeting, where in general you have the same flaws that in the overall UN process. One of the priorities of BASIC should be really to create a strong link with the European communities and work out some differences that we have with you in order that we can together assure a second period of commitment of the Kyoto Protocol, which I think is absolutely fundamental. Not that the Kyoto Protocol is that good, but it's basically what we have. It's the only mechanism that binds different countries to a certain target. And it's the basis of the whole carbon economy. So if the Kyoto Protocol unravels in Durban, and it might happen, it really might happen, not only will be in a world where no country whatsoever has any legally binding goals, but the whole basis for what is absolutely fundamental, which is the carbon economy, will be compromised. We have to rediscuss the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. Because it's true, things have changed since 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was signed. Today, the developing world has a larger part in the emissions, and in 2020 it will be likely near to 70%. And at the same time, you have per capita data and historic data. So we have to re-grasp this thing and put it into a slightly different perspective. Because we know climate justice is important, but the question is that the future of the planet doesn't depend on per capita, doesn't depend on historic emissions, depends on what will be emitted in the future. But on the other hand, one has to take into consideration both historical data and per capita. So what we think this should be basically addressed on the level of finance, under the principle the polluter pays, and the countries responsible for 70% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere should pay 70% of the bill. And I think this is really important. When we start discussing finance, this matter was addressed. I remember that in the year of the Copenhagen conference, there was a report by the World Bank about 475 billion US dollars. We know that what was really decided was 100, and what we have up to now, theoretically, is 30. So we are way, way, way away from the minimum necessary. And if we consider that the US has spent $1 trillion in the war in Iraq, we have things under the correct perspective. As far as mitigation is concerned, I do really think that everybody should be in. And Brazil has given the example by setting a goal of reducing in 38% its emissions considering the base year 2005 against the business as usual curve, but having as a consequence a reduction of overall emissions of nearly 20%. So I think, of course, there are different situations. I think China should start reducing its overall emissions in a certain period. India may be a little bit later, but we should agree on the principle that everybody should be in. Another thing that I think is absolutely fundamental, since the most important thing of all is the mobilization of the public opinion of different countries. If the societies are not mobilized, nothing will happen. It's important for a good information to have common metrics. And the metrics are very difficult to understand. I have met even seasoned journalists that don't really grasp and are not able to compare the goals of different countries because, well, the European Union reduces against the year base of 1990. Brazil and the US, if it had kept its commitment to the Copenhagen meeting, its base year is 2005. There are certain countries that have 1992, others that have 2000. China and India work on carbon intensity on each point of GDP. We have to arrive to a common metrics in order to really compare the efforts of what different countries are doing. So about the UN, I think that it's important to have a double track. UN is extremely important, but we should not exclude the possibility of having other groups that informally discuss the matter. And one proposition that we're doing in Brazil, in the Brazilian Congress, is if we have bad news in Durban, if Durban really doesn't come to a satisfactory conclusion, we should profit of the occasion of the Rio +20 to have a side event where the President of Brazil invites the chiefs of state or the ministers of foreign relations and the environment of what would be a G climate. Basically, the 20 or so main emitters with some of the most vulnerable countries to try not to substitute the UN process, but to facilitate it, because it's easier, finally, to come to a conclusion among 20 or so main polluters and some of the most vulnerable countries than to work with the UN process with a consensus of 193 countries, hopefully 194 if the Palestinian state is admitted in the UN by then. So the idea is to try to facilitate. We have to really think out of the box. And finally, what is the issue we would like to see in Durban, realistically speaking? First of all, the second period of commitment of the Kyoto Protocol, with at the least deserting countries as possible. We know that Russia says it wants out, Japan wants out, but to try to limit this to the minimum. A commitment by the non-Annex I countries that they would accept mandatory goals, accept legally binding goals from 2020 on, if the United States are in. Then the division of the financial burden accordingly to the principle the polluter pays, and a strong boost to carbon economics. To achieve this, it will demand a lot of negotiating skills, a lot of political skills. The relationship between basic and European Union is absolutely fundamental, but this has not been addressed in a politically sound way, with responsibilities shared. But I think you should look into the responsibilities of the European Union. And then, and to end, I think we have to mobilize. We have to mobilize our societies. Because without their pressure, without the pressure of public opinion all over the world, it would be extremely difficult to achieve any kind of goal. Thank you very much.